Very happy to welcome this afternoon Alexander Hook in Berlin. As some of you may guess from the family name, he is actually from Switzerland. And he was serving until very recently, October 31st, as deputy head of the OSCE special monitoring mission to Ukraine, which was located in the eastern parts of Ukraine, which right now are in a very difficult territory. You also could say under occupation. So he has lots of first-hand experience about this conflict or conflicts, which has been exacerbated again in the recent days by, as you all know, the skirmishes in the Azov Straits or Kerch Straits. So I think it's going to be a very interesting afternoon, because you get lots of assessments, not only from an academic perspective, but also from a very practical, everyday perspective, which I think is very valuable. Alexander was trained as a lawyer in Fribourg and Aberdeen, is that right? So he has a legal background for his work. And I'm very happy that he found his way today to Berlin. Thanks for coming. And now please welcome with me Alexander Hook for his presentation.
Thank you. Do I need this or?
No?
Okay, thank you.
Go ahead.
So, good afternoon. Thank you for welcoming me here, Professor, and dear audience here today. Thank you for your interest in coming here this afternoon to listen to me. As just said, I have been leaving the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, not because I had enough, but because I have reached a 10 years limit that one can serve in a lifetime for the OSCE. And as you know, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe was originally a conference, and that is also the reason why the members of the organization are not called member states, they are called participating states, and that is also why the organization, once it had morphed into an organization, by the way, without legal personality, quite important as well, and I will outline later why that is. The organization has then limited also the duration of how long people can actually work with it. So that just briefly on top of what you have just heard to my background. Now, before I went to Ukraine, I have worked for another OSCE institution, and that was the OSCE High Commissioner on National Minorities. It is an executive institution, an independent institution based in The Hague in the Netherlands. And it was early in 2014 when Switzerland, the participating states of the OSCE at the time holding the chairmanship, this year, that is Italy, it changes every year. So back in early 2014, the Swiss Foreign Ministry calls me and asks me if I would be willing to take part in a small monitoring mission in Ukraine. That was before the conflict, that was February 2014. And you know what happened in those early days. In 2014, the annexation of Crimea took place there towards the end of February, around 26th of February that is. And later on then, on the 21st of March, and that's quite an important date, 21st of March 2014, the Permanent Council of the OSCE, that's the decision-making body of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, has decided to dispatch, within 24 hours of it had taken that decision, a special monitoring mission to Ukraine. The decision, and I'm not outlining this now in all detail, you can read it on the website of the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission, has the number 1117. So that's the decision taken then, and that's at the same time the mandate of the Special Monitoring Mission. It's a 2-page document, very brief. It's really worthwhile to read it. And why the date is so important? Because the mandate given to it at this date remains the same to this day. It hasn't changed since then. That may also be then immediately make clear that the conflict as such that erupted later on is not mentioned in that document itself. And when you read the mandate, that decision 1117, you will not find a reference to the armed conflict in eastern Ukraine. You will not find a reference to the Minsk agreements. and you will not find any task in there that would suggest that the special monitoring mission deployed there at the end of March should monitor a ceasefire. You will find none of that in that specific mandate. Now what you will find are very broad formulations, and it will be in that document where you will find that the special monitoring mission should monitor the security situation in Ukraine. And that one sentence, and we'll find that in that document, is the basis for much of what the mission is doing now. Overall, the mandate has given two basic mandates, tasks for the mission. So if we look at this as a house here, the foundation, again, we have here the decision 1117. And the two basic tasks given in that decision to the special monitoring mission is, on the one hand side, what the mission is best known for is monitoring and reporting. And the mandate speaks about establishing facts of incidents or reported incidents. And a second pillar that the mandate has given to that dialogue facilitation. Dialogue facilitation to ease tension, speaking to everyone across Ukraine. And that, as such, makes up the special monitoring mission to Ukraine, or in shorthand, the SMM. Quite important. The SMM doesn't stand for Special Minsk Mission, because Minsk came half a year later, but it's a special monitoring mission. And it is decided by and guided by 57 participating states, which the OSCE is comprised of. That includes Ukraine and the Russian Federation, but also my own state, Switzerland, Germany, and many others. And why that is so important is because the mandate as such could only be changed or amended if all of these 57 in consensus would agree to it. So it's not the Normandy format, it is not Ukraine or Russia, and for sure not those who claim to be in effective control in Donetsk and Luhansk who can change this mandate. It is only the 57 participating states that could change the mandate or end it, for that matter, or enlarge it. And that is quite important also when we look at possible positive or negative aspects of this mandate. Now, when we dispatched, and that had to be done within 24 hours of the 21st of March 2014, we had great difficulties, of course, to find the resources, the human resources first, to dispatch to 10 cities across Ukraine. And these 10 cities, you will find them listed in that permanent council decision. Of course, Donetsk and Luhansk, but there are 8 other cities as well across Ukraine. So it's Lviv, Ivano-Frankivsk, Chernivtsi, Odessa, Kiev itself, Kharkiv, Dnipro, and Kherson, across Ukraine, because the mandate was not just for the eastern part, because it happened, of course, before the conflict erupted, but it was a special monitoring mission to Ukraine. The OSCE had then thought of how it best could go about in deploying so quickly, and it had asked other field operations, and you know, for instance, in the Balkans, there are several operations of the OSCE, but also in Central Asia, there are several field operations where it had called upon so-called first responders. They basically got a phone call in the evening of the 21st and had to be at the airport in their respective country the following morning, and then deployed to Kiev, to these cities. And the monitoring mission started to monitor in the evening of the 22nd and started to report on the day of the 23rd of March 2014. And the first tasks there were quite different to what we do now. You probably remember that at the time, the Maidan, the big square downtown in Kiev, was still in turmoil. Most of it was blocked up. Official buildings there were still occupied. And I remember the first task there in Kiev, and I was deployed to Kiev, to that newly established headquarters then, was to facilitate a dialogue with those who were occupying at the time the municipal building, for instance, down in the Maidan. Very quickly then, however, our colleagues that were deployed to Donetsk and Luhansk, they were flying there with a normal civilian aircraft or went by train to Donetsk or Luhansk, they started to report in that there were small-scale demonstrations in the streets of Donetsk and Luhansk, and what happened afterwards happened very quickly. The demonstrations got quite large. They started to concentrate around those key buildings in these towns, administrative buildings, but also communication installations, TV towers, radio stations. And while at the beginning these protesters were unarmed, we saw that they then were armed with wooden sticks first. They turned into metal sticks, turned into sidearms, turned into Kalashnikovs, turned into mortars, turned into artillery devices, into multiple launch rocket systems, and within a very short period of time, the Special Monitoring Mission found itself confronted with a full-fledged armed conflict for which it was not prepared, neither by the staff, or most of the staff it had recruited at the time, but also by its equipment, for instance. At the time, in early 2014, the monitoring mission had no armed vehicles in the mission itself, and had only then to find that equipment later on in order then to be able to confront the emerging risk that it had been exposed by. And you might also find back in the public available data that in early 2014, in May, when the mission had been already in place for a couple of months, that 8 of its monitors were taken hostage by those people who claimed effective control in Donetsk and Luhansk region. It took a month to get them out from where they were. They were eventually released physically unharmed. Now, the conflict then evolved very quickly, but it was very patchy. It was no clear line at the time. There was no Minsk agreement still. In May, June, July, August, big fights erupted in several locations. Ilovaisk, for instance, was one that you're probably also familiar with, but also around the international airport in Donetsk, where also big fights started to erupt. Then, in late of 2014, respectively in the summer of 2014, the so-called Normandy format started to meet to commemorate events in Normandy. Russia, Ukraine, Germany and France got together at the side of that meeting, which then created the so-called Normandy format, and decided that a mechanism must be found to deal with the emerging violence. And that happened on the 6th of June, if my recollection is correct, in Normandy. So on the 6th of June, these 4 participating states of the OSCE have met there in France. And you can already see now this is far after the mission has been put in place. There they have decided that a so-called trilateral contact group should be set up. And on the 8th of June, so 2 days later, in 2014, this trilateral contact group for the first time met then in Kiev, at the time at the headquarters of the Special Monitoring Mission. At that time it was made up of Ukraine, the Russian Federation, represented by its embassy, at the time there still present an ambassador in Kiev, and the OSCE as the third part of it. So the Trilateral Contact Group, the TCG, had then first met and tried to find ways and mechanisms to deal with the violence that erupted. So once again, we had the Ukraine, the Russian Federation, and the OSCE. And the OSCE was represented at the time with a special representative of the chairman in office, which was, as I've said in the beginning, Switzerland. And at that time, it was Ambassador Tagliavini, who was the special representative of the chairman in office and who was then that part of the Trilateral Contact Group. Not the SMM, not the chairman himself, but it was a special representative. Now, this post is filled by Ambassador Seidig of Austria, who is, at the moment as we speak, the special representative of the chairman in office, which is the Italian foreign minister, because Italy at the moment has the chairmanship. And that allows me now to also explain you the process of Minsk, which is slightly different than the mandate of the Special Monitoring Mission. Now, It took a while until September 2014 when the first 2 out of a total of 7 agreements had been signed in Minsk. These first 2 documents, they're the Memorandum of Minsk and the Protocol of Minsk, signed in the first half of September 2014, normally referred to as Minsk I. When you read in the media, that is normally referred to as Minsk I, but it's 2 documents, distinct documents. That is in September 14, and you see now that the mission has already been there in place for roughly half a year before those first agreements actually had been signed. The mission immediately started then to monitor the implementation of these agreements, but agreements themselves, but by its mandate, because the mandate, as I've mentioned before, said it should monitor and report, and in particular, it should monitor the security situation. And of course, the armed violence in the eastern part fits in that very broad formulated task given to it before the conflict had erupted. So it was an interpretation of the mandate that was broad formulated, and I encourage you once again to read that, and you will see that you can actually read quite a bit into that mandate, and the mission started then to observe whether or not these documents that were signed then in September 14 and had also started to report publicly about it. And in terms of reporting, it's also very important for you to note that this field operation of the OSCE, the Special Monitoring Mission, is the first that had in its history of the OSCE decided to report daily publicly. Normally these reports are diplomatic cables. They would not be made public. They would be sent to the participating states, but they would be restricted, if not confidential, reports. But the mission, in conjunction with the chairmanship and the secretariat, has decided and has continued ever since then to make these daily reports public, to contribute with objective, verified information to the very blurred situation that was then still confusing everyone that read either Russian-orientated media or Western-orientated media. So the mission there felt also by making its findings public, it does contribute at least with some objective insight into the situation on the ground. And that started before the conflict has erupted, because also there it was important to make clear what is actually happening on Maidan, what is happening in Kherson or Dnipro. But it became even more important, of course, when the mission started to look into the implementation of these agreements. Now, the agreements themselves, and also these first 2, they had 4 basic aspects. They had a security aspect, the most obvious one, that includes the non-use of weapons. That's the language used in this agreement, which is the code for ceasefire. Then the security also included the withdrawal of hardware, military hardware, heavy weapons, and heavy weapons are tanks, so large caliber weapon, not the small arms, the Kalashnikov or the pistol, but those that create real havoc and are lethal weapons and indiscriminate weapons. It also referred to, very important, a stop of laying mines and also removing mines that have already been in the ground at the time. These agreements also included a humanitarian part, where humanitarian aid should be able to be delivered, for instance, or where prisoners should be, or those deprived of their liberty on either side, should be exchanged. They also included an economic part, because of course the economy, and those of you who have studied that specific part of Ukraine know that the heavy industry in that area lays at the center of the fighting there. So also that, of course, had been taken into account. And there is a political part, the 4th part of these agreements, that should prepare for eventual elections that should be taking place there, and all the mechanisms that are required to organize there. So 4 specific, distinct points that had been included in these agreements. Now, as you know, after September 14, the security part, including the non-use of weapons or the ceasefire, did not work. You will find these accounts in the publicly available reports of the Special Monitoring Mission, available on its website, where on a daily basis it had registered hundreds, if not thousands, of ceasefire violations, of violations committed by the sides in violation of the agreements they have signed. Now I should open a bracket here. On these documents that have been signed in September 2014, there are not only 3 signatures on it, not only that of Russia, Ukraine, and the OSCE, but there are 2 other signatures on that document, and these are the signatures of the armed formations, those people in effective control in Donetsk and Luhansk. But they didn't sign in any title or in any representative forms, they just signed in their name. So and at that time, in September 2014, you will find there signatures of Mr. Sakarchenko and Mr. Plotnitsky, but with no title to it, just with their family names and their signature to it, of course, while the others here, Ukraine and the Russian Federation in particular, had signed with their respective title of the participant there that had been present there. And that is quite important to note that as well, that there is the trilateral contact group format, but responsibilities, of course, lie beyond that trilateral format, including those that are responsible for the violence committed in areas not controlled by the government. And these 2 signatories there that I have referred to before, in particular, have taken on that responsibility. That's important also when reading the reports of the Special Monitoring Mission. You'll find there the references to the armed formations, which are those armed groups operating in areas beyond government control. But the mission itself had to upgrade itself. It had to increase the numbers of monitors. Also, that information you will find publicly available on the website of the mission itself. At the moment, over 700 monitors, over 400 Ukrainian staff, and another over 100 international staff members, making up over 1,200 mission members that now work for this special monitoring mission. Most of them work in these 2 eastern teams in Donetsk and Luhansk region and live and work on both sides of the contact line. But there are still monitoring teams elsewhere in Ukraine. You have one in Kiev, you have the ones in further west, in Lviv, in Chernivtsi, in Ivano-Frankivsk, down in Odessa, in Kherson, in Dnipro, in Kharkiv. These teams, as they had been deployed in March 14, continue to operate to this day. They're smaller, of course, but they also implement the mandate given to it back in March 2014. And they also do monitor conflict-related events, including, for instance, what happens to internally displaced persons that this conflict has produced. Officially, over 1.5 million of them that had been internally displaced inside Ukraine, and they, of course, now reside in cities and areas outside the eastern part of the country, and the monitors elsewhere in the country are also able to see how they've been received, how they're able then to go about their lives, whether they find work. They're also there to see and monitor other security-related incidents outside the eastern part. Most recently, for instance, demonstrations taking place in front of the Russian embassy in Kiev over the weekend. You will find the reference to those incidents also in the reports of the Special Monitoring Mission on its website. Very quickly, the mission faced great difficulties in operating in the area of the conflict itself, and difficulties mainly and predominantly related to security risks, and security risks either imposed on the mission, which led to imposed restrictions, but then those that were simply present in the area. And that led then to the mission to find alternative ways to continue to monitor despite these restrictions. And the one thing the mission did was to deploy cameras, unmanned aerial vehicles, UAVs, and had also access to satellite imagery. All of the information that this technology does produce is also available in the daily reports of the SMM and contributes to the observation the mission does undertake. Cameras are fixed installed in areas where the monitors would have normally no access. UAVs are being used in areas where it is too dangerous to operate, or once again where the mission cannot access areas, and satellite imagery is used to compare, because you can also look back in time, the situation on the ground itself. And all of the information that the monitors get together and the information that the technology does contribute to it finds its way then every day, with the exception of Sunday, into a daily report that the monitoring mission does make public, and you will find that, and I recommend to read some of these reports that you find there. It makes it public not only in English, but also in Ukrainian and in Russian every day, so that not just the international community, but also the local population, the media, has direct access to the verified information that the mission produces. Now, a few words, with your permission, on the second bigger task here, on the dialogue facilitation part. That's one thing that is not so known, but is visible also in these reports that you may read on its website. Now, the mission, because it is present on both sides of the contact line, that line that divides government-controlled from non-government-controlled areas, almost 500 kilometers long is that line. Over that line, there is a lot of infrastructure, for instance, that lies. There is roads, railway links, electricity lines, gas pipelines, water pipelines that lie across that line, because the line was drawn artificially, it didn't exist before September 2014, but because that line became the line where the opposing forces and formations would stand against each other, the infrastructure, of course, is heavily affected by the continued fighting. Now, if you need to repair a broken gas pipeline in the middle of two positions, you would need to reach some agreement between the sides. And they don't talk to one another directly. You know that also from what you read. The Ukrainian armed forces do not directly exchange or communicate with the armed formations. And there the mission can build a bridge with its patrols on both sides of the contact line. It does communicate with itself, so a patrol on the non-government side communicates with its patrol on the government-controlled side, and each patrol has contact either to the government forces or then to the armed formations on the non-government side, and therefore it can arrange localized ceasefires which then enable repair crews to come in and repair gas, water, electricity pipelines. But it also allows for the recovery of the dead, for instance, that are fallen in the middle of positions and nobody can take them out. But it also allows the delivery of humanitarian aid. It also allows at some point that civilians that are trapped between positions can move or bring in aid and help that they need. Now, of course, that is all symptom treatment, because the fighting and the positions of the fighting forces do not change. So very often, once the repair has been conducted, the fighting continues and the damage is done again, which would then require, of course, once again, that the mission would come out and deal with the same damage again. The main cause for the continued fighting, and that is also visible in the reports, is the close proximity of the positions, the distance between the government forces and the armed formations, often just a few hundred meters, even less, where they face each other. That means even without fighting, tensions are very high in these areas. Just a wrong flag or an insult hurled across the position may be enough to start a fight. And once it starts, normally with small arms fire, it then very quickly translates into long-lasting battles. And the second reason is that of the presence of heavy weapons, and I've mentioned them before. These are tanks, mortars, artillery, including multiple launch rocket systems, in areas where they should not be according to the agreements, because the agreements have foreseen that these weapons are being drawn back from the front positions into an area where they can't be used any longer, so beyond engagement distance. So that's for a small mortar, that's between 4 and 5 kilometers. Normally, they have to go back 15, so they're for sure out of firing range, but then it goes even further back for the bigger, larger caliber. You will also find in specific sections of these daily reports of the Special Monitoring Mission where these weapons are still be seen by the mission in areas where they should not be. And of course they are in areas not to be stored or to be maintained. They are normally in engagement positions or in a predisposition position to be used to continue that fight. And these weapons, these heavy weapons, are indiscriminate weapons. They are not precision weapons, so an artillery shell can't hit a precise aim on the other side of the contact line. If you want to hit a tank on the other side, you can't precisely hit it with an artillery device. It will land depending on the wind or the angle of where the barrel was standing in before it had been fired in a wide area, and it is indiscriminate. It is also indiscriminate because it doesn't just explode, it also produces a shower of shrapnel. This is metal shrapnel that when the round explodes, then sprays the area, and depending on the caliber of the round, these shrapnels are also indiscriminate because you don't know where they land, and they fly at lightning speed. They will go through these walls here like through butter, and you can imagine what it would do to a human body if you stand too close to these areas. And you might stand in your kitchen, in your yard, while a few 10, 20 or so meters away a round explodes, and you are at high risk of being injured or killed. The last reason why the work of the Special Monitoring Mission is so dangerous and why the fighting continues is that of the continued placement of mines, mainly anti-tank mines that are put in the ground, that are polluting the area on both sides of the contact line at a large distance. You will find in the reports of the mission that it had seen mainly anti-tank mines, but also anti-personnel mines and improvised explosive devices. The latter part are, however, the exceptions. But the early agreements of 2014 and subsequent agreements reached in Minsk have clearly foreseen that these mines should not be placed any longer, and those who have been in the ground already should have been removed. Now, with your permission, just a few reflections that maybe gives also a good starting point for a discussion later on challenges that the mission has been meeting. And I've mentioned a few already, and I sum up now here again, just so it gets into boxes, so it will also help then to steer our discussion later on. I would first start with political challenges, and that starts with the definition of this conflict. And as we have heard in the beginning, you have seen that now in the Azov Sea, in the Black Sea, the conflict seems to continue, but outside where the Special Monitoring Mission at the moment is operating. And you know that the OSCE refers to the conflict as the conflict in and around Ukraine. So not just limited to Ukraine itself, and diplomatically formulated as the conflict in and around Ukraine. And that, of course, also leads then to the question as to who is part or party to that conflict. And of course, the question about the definition leads automatically to the question about who is part of that conflict, and you know who says that it is part and who says it is not part of the conflict itself. It is also important to understand, like the Special Monitoring Mission, a political mission. It is very difficult to avoid not to become part of the conflict itself, of the problem itself. For instance, when the mission, in its dialogue facilitation, all of a sudden becomes a condition of the agreements, saying, for instance, that the mission must be there before we do withdraw the weapons or start to disengage weapons. That is another problem there. the presence itself near the fighting and near that contact line may also lead to a political problem, that is of cementing that contact line, that artificial line, into something much more than a contact line. Another challenge, and equally political of course, are the OSCE participating states. They read the mandate as you will read and as I have read, and because it's so broad formulated, they will have a wide range of interpretation of it. Some want the special monitoring mission to look at the fate of national minorities in the western part of Ukraine. You have probably heard in the course of this year that there had been quite a lot of reporting about the Hungarian minority in the western part of Ukraine, for instance. And then, of course, there were some participating states who said you need to shift resources to the western part. So a quite different range of views of how the mandate should be implemented. Working at the contact line is very risky. Participating states that contribute with their staff, all, with a few exceptions, international staff working for the mission, are so-called seconded staff, contributed by participating states, and they have different views of how much risk is acceptable. Also, that leads to quite a lot of challenges for the mission. So 57 different assessments, often that had to be equated onto a common ground. Then participating states pay for this mission, of course, and they want to see value in return for it. It's very difficult to measure success in an observer mission. You would, of course, say the end of the conflict would be the success. That's probably a very broad formulated goal, but what it is very difficult now in these 4.5 years is to demonstrate that the presence of these 700 monitors has actually contributed to a reduction of violence. And why is that complicated? Because you can't prove it, because the absence of violence isn't there. You can't monitor it. You can only monitor the existence of violence. So they're quite another formidable challenge. The question also in this context is how much monitoring is required for those who need to end the fighting, who have promised to end the fighting, to understand what they need to be doing. Is 10,000 violations a day enough to understand that the ceasefire is not really holding, or is 20,000, 50,000 needed? That means, of course, there would be more staff needed on the ground. Another challenge there to find the right balance. I have explained already previously about the very broad formulated mandate that we are dealing with. Their interpretations are possible to a large spectrum. There is also a problem in expectation vis-à-vis the mission, that the mission stops the fighting, for which there is no mandate. The mandate is to monitor and to facilitate dialogue. Stopping the fighting is that the sides have been committing to do. The mission will document whether they do so or not, but nonetheless, as the largest international presence there, there is an expectation, of course, that the mission itself is there to stop the fighting. Then the sides, in multiple plural, without defining them now, are a challenge in themselves, not least because there is a clear lack of accountability, also vis-à-vis violations of our own mandate. So every restriction of our freedom of movement, for instance, is a violation of the Minsk Agreement, but also of our mandate itself. But there is no real mechanism to hold those to account who do not abide by what they have been promising for. I have already alluded to some of the operational challenges that the mission faces. First of all, it's a very large area that the mission covers, not just in Ukraine itself, but in particular in the eastern part of Ukraine. The Donetsk and Luhansk Oblast, the two regions in the far eastern part of Ukraine, are larger than Switzerland, 53,000 square kilometers. So where I come from, the country there is smaller than these two regions in the far east. The contact line itself, as I've mentioned, is almost 500 kilometers long. The unsecure border with the Russian Federation, where Ukraine has no control at the moment, is over 400 kilometers long. And then the open shore, where there is also no Ukrainian control, is, depending how you measure, between 50 and 70 kilometers long. So just the lines around this area is almost 1,000 kilometers, 53,000 square kilometers to cover. That's quite a formidable challenge. Communications in these areas is also very difficult. You can't rely on mobile phones any longer in that area, and particularly not near the contact line, because they are interrupted because of damages to fiber optic cables that run across the contact line. So we had to establish our own communication network there. Internet is also difficult, therefore. What would normally be no question of reporting through internet also becomes quite difficult. You should not forget that Luhansk is on the road 800 kilometers away from Kiev, where the headquarters of the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission sits. It's quite a challenge also to manage so much staff so far away from its headquarters. And then, of course, the security risks are operational risks as well. Risk to be caught in crossfire of these indiscriminate weapons, risk to be caught in a minefield or hit a mine. And as you probably know, in early 2017, we have lost the first and thus far only colleague in an operational activity, what we believe was an explosion of an anti-tank mine that an armed vehicle had hit off the mission itself. Now, these are just some of these challenges that the mission had been exposed to, and there are many more, of course, and I'm sure you will have additional questions there too. Now, where will this lead to? The mission mandate is limited for a year, initially only 6 months, but ever since then it is renewed every end of March. So the next time the 57 participating states need to agree to extend this mission would be at the end of March next year. And then the mission will again likely be extended for an additional period, be it a year or whatever then the participating states will agree. And that depends, of course, on the political assessments they undertake, but it also depends on the financial means they would like to make available for this quite large mission with a budget that is quite heavy, a burden for the entire organization. Until then, of course, the mission will continue to implement its mandate, and it is not up to the mission itself, not up to the Normandy 4, at least not only, but up to the 57 participating states to decide whether or not that mission should continue operating as it does now. I think I will leave it at that as introduction, but I'm sure there are many questions now where we can have a more interactive discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.